Well, good morning, friends, and welcome to the Alaska Historical Society annual meeting. First, a big thank you to Rachel Mason and the program committee for putting together such a full and interesting group of presentations. And thanks to Karen Brewster, who is our chief pilot and Zoom navigator operating in her control room in Fairbanks. To Carol Gales, who produced the handsome program bulletin that you should have received in the mail. To Joe Antonson, who keeps track of all things that could easily get forgotten. And special support we acknowledge from the Alaska Humanities Forum and the National Endowment for the Humanities for their support of this conference. Thank you very much. Events of the last several years make it abundantly clear that an understanding of history is really essential to sound decision-making in our communities, the state, the nation, and indeed the world. Without background on issues, our arguments flap in the wind dangerously as signposts for the indiscriminate souls who mindlessly pass them on as knowledge. History is the toolkit and the manual we need now more than ever. This has been made abundantly clear to me in the work of the Advocacy Committee of the Alaska Historical Society, where under Ian Hartman's guidance, we've tackled policy questions on public monuments, the importance of preserving and supporting accessible archives, and most recently, the misuse of historical references to the Holocaust. I hope all of you will join us in our continued efforts to bring historical knowledge to the public. To that end, let the meeting begin. Rachel?
Thank you. Let's need to share my screen here. Okay. Somehow I got to the wrong slide there. So let me try it again. Welcome to the Alaska Historical Society's annual conference, 2021, Communities Remembered and Imagined. We have some great sessions in store for you. Coming up today, we have the keynote speech from Tom Kaziah, The Impermanent Past, Living in the Space Between. And following that, we're going to have a session on the ghosts of former mines, and also at 3:30, Myth and Delusion in Southeast Alaska. And there's much more coming up in the days to follow. October 14th, we'll have 3 panels honoring the 50th anniversary of ANCSA, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. These will include a conversation including Emil Nadi and Sam Keto with moderator Megan Sullivan. There's also a panel with Willie Hensley and Oliver Leavitt, moderated by Patrick Glenn. And on the same day at 3:30, there's Historical Perspectives on ANCSA with panelists Philip White, Daniel Monteith, and Stephen Haycox, moderated by Will Schneider. And there are more conference highlights. There's a forum on teaching American history on October 9th. That same day, there's a meeting of the local historical societies, and there'll be a workshop on techniques of history that focuses on genealogical research with Melissa Barker. On October 15th, we have the Alaska Historical Society business meeting. And throughout the time, there are over 30 presentations about Alaska history, different aspects of it. And it should be just great. I want to direct your attention to some changes to the print program. You may have received a program in the mail, but there's some updates to that which you can find online. There are different URLs for the Zoom instructions. If you need some instructions to be a presenter, an attendee, or a moderator, look online and use those URLs. And another update is that we've added some authors to one of the presentations on October 8th, tomorrow. This is some of the authors that are, the full list of authors is right here, and it's also online in our program, but it didn't make it into the print program. We have a few tips for the best Zoom experience, just best practices to keep yourself muted and your video off unless you're the one presenting. If you're one of the audience, you can only talk when you raise your hand and the host gives you a prompt to unmute. And remember to remute after you've asked a question. If you're having technical difficulties, you can use the chat feature to message the host, which is usually Karen Brewster, or to ask questions during the Q&A. If you don't want to speak up in front of everybody, that's fine. Use the chat feature. So we have a lot of thanking to do. We need to thank the Alaska Humanities Forum and the National Endowment for the Humanities for their help in funding the conference. And the conference committee, especially Karen Brewster for coordinating the technical matters, and Carol Gales for designing the program. And to all of you, the presenters, moderators, and participants for showing such an interest in Alaska history. I hope you enjoy this. I hope you enjoy the conference. Thank you. Turn it over to Karen.
Hi. So I am doing multiple things at the same time here. So it is my pleasure today to introduce our keynote speaker, Tom Kaziah. I have known Tom since at least the late 1980s, I think. I can't quite remember exactly when, but I met him through a former professor of mine, Dick Cooley, at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And since then, I've followed Tom's career and have been a big fan. And as a writer myself, I'm always inspired by his great talents and have looked to his writings as a model for my own. Tom is originally from New Jersey and a graduate of Hampshire College in Massachusetts. And he came to Alaska in the late 1970s and got a job as the editor and writing for the Homer News. This led to a 25-year career as a reporter for the Anchorage Daily News, publication of the bestseller book Pilgrim's Wilderness that was selected by the New York Times Book Review in a 50-state survey as the best true crime book in Alaska. He also wrote the village travel narrative, The Wake of the Unseen Object, which is now just last year, I guess, was re-released by University of Alaska Press. And then he's written many articles in the New Yorker, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, and the Columbia Journalism Review. He also received an artist fellowship from the Rasmussen Foundation in 2017, which I think led to the writing, which helped supported the writing of this current book. And then in 1999, 2000, he was a Knight Journalism Fellow at Stanford University. And so although I knew Tom from a long time ago, our lives were not particularly interconnected until 2017, when I was doing research for a National Park Service project on the ethnography of the Wrangels region. And when I was in Mccarthy asking people questions, they kept saying, well, Tom Kaziah is working on a quote, history of Mccarthy. And so Tom and I reconnected over that and were able to share some information. And that history of Mccarthy is what it has become Tom's current book called Mountain Path, The Ghost Town Decades of McCarthy, Kennecott, Alaska, 1938 to 1983, which I just happen to have a wonderful copy of. And it just came out this week. It's published by Porphyry Press, a new imprint press in McCarthy. And it's now available for purchase in your local bookstore or at Porphyry Press's website that I will put into the chat so people can see that website, or Jeremy Pataki, who is the publisher, who's on with us, he can type that in if he wants. So when I heard that the conference theme was going to be communities remembered and imagined, focusing on the life cycles of communities and those phases that exist only in memory or imagination, I immediately thought of Tom and his book about the period in McCarthy's history when the town was nearly abandoned. I didn't know at the time the timing was going to work out so perfectly for release of the book. But by focusing on the stories of individuals who stayed and made McCarthy their home, Tom demonstrates how history is created as much through the intertwined daily lives of regular people as by big events and public figures. In his presentation this morning, titled The Impermanent Past, Living in the Space Between, Tom will talk about how the ghost town story provides an essential counterbalance to the boom narrative of the frontier, and the special meaning the quote, lost decades have to the story of the iconic ghost town of McCarthy, Kennecott. So thank you, Tom, for joining us this morning. And Jeremy has put in their website if you guys all want to rush out and buy the book after Tom's talk. So thank you.
Thank you, Karen. That was a really nice introduction. And thank you all for letting me speak to you. I've spent the last few days trying to figure out what I meant by that title. And so it was encompassing enough, I think, to talk about I wanted to talk about local histories and historical narratives, and my subject and what went into writing this book. So I'd like to begin with a tale of two bridges. One of them you will already know because it's famous in Alaska history. The $1 Million Bridge was the crowning achievement of the Copper River and Northwestern Railroad. It was a powerful steel and concrete edifice completed in 1910, mere hours before the river ice breakup tore away its essential construction supports. The other bridge in my tale also crossed the Copper River, but it was farther in the interior at Chitna, closer to the Kennecott copper mines. This railroad bridge was built out of sticks. The trestle was allowed to wash away every spring when the ice went out. Rebuilding each year was cheaper than erecting a steel span, given the short life expectancy of the mine. The construction of the $1 Million Bridge became a symbol of American progress and ambition and strength. Its photo finish construction figured as the melodramatic heart of a best-selling novel, The Iron Trail. The popular novelist Rex Beach envisioned how progress would follow the locomotives across the bridge. Quote, I saw the unpeopled North grow into a land of homes, of farms, of mining camps, where people lived and bred children. I heard the mountain passes echo to steam whistles and the whir of flying wheels. An epic Hollywood feature followed, though without the mountain echo of steam whistles, this still being the era of silent films. No comparable epic was ever made of the wooden bridge left to fall apart when the mines shut down, until now. Your conference theme, Communities Remembered and Imagined, finally gives us the opportunity to consider the story of those people left isolated on the far side of the Copper River after Kennecott Copper abandoned Alaska and the wooden bridge went out one last time. The ghost town of McCarthy, which grew up to serve the Kennecott mines and then shriveled when the mines closed, stands for many such communities in Alaska, places with names like Poor Man, Cripple, Eureka, and Sunrise, places half remembered and now buried in the American psyche, where they lie wrapped in a shroud of mythology all their own and provide an important counter-narrative to the tales of imperial success and expansion. Given that I have a book that came out this week on this very topic, as Karen kindly pointed out, I just want to pause here and say thank you to the Alaska Historical Society for serving up your theme on such a lovely platter to me. I come to speak about communities remembered and imagined as a duly humble interloper. I'm not trained as a historian and a lecturer like so many of you. I approached my new book on this subject as I approached the rest of my career as a journalist drawn to stories about Alaska in transition. I will say that back when I was an undergraduate at my small New England college, I had so much fun with 19th century history and literature that I considered going on to graduate school in American studies. This was never more true than the morning I sat in a teacher's living room and listened to the historian and critic Leo Marx unlock the writing of Hawthorne, Melville, Thoreau, and Mark Twain and their encounters with the American continent through his brilliant metaphor of the machine in the garden. In the end, I stuck with my plan to be a journalist, but I discovered in Alaska an ideal subject for an American studies major, a place where the last devotees of manifest destiny still had an open field of play. And by this, I don't mean just the board of directors of the Alaska Industrial Development and Export Authority. Stories about the end to this conquer the continent mentality were what motivated me as a reporter for the Anchorage Daily News, where I wrote my first rough drafts of history. Writing books allowed me to go deeper. My first book was about the transition underway in the 1980s in rural Alaska Native communities and about the countervailing rural forces of tradition and ties to the land. My second book, also nonfiction, was about the lingering mythology of American pioneering and how a family patriarch in the Wrangell Mountains used that mythology to hide his own evil and destructive designs. A lot of the Alaska historical background that I wrote for that book was eventually cut out of the manuscript. Rather than let Papa Pilgrim's weird twist on American history get in the way of the main story, which was his horrifying twist on fatherhood. The museum in McCarthy asked me to save those local history chapters. I offered to expand on them as a museum fundraiser. And before I knew it, I was learning how to keep track of footnotes. The book that took off from that beginning was driven in part, I now see, by my old undergraduate enthusiasms. I was unlikely to find a more perfect machine in the garden than a Copper River and Northwestern locomotive whistling through a future national park. My subject was the town that was born and nearly died from that meeting between technology and nature. This wasn't just any ghost town I was writing about. McCarthy and Kennecott have a certain exalted, pre-certified status as a subject for intellectual inquiry. Because in 1992, the historian William Cronin wrote a widely read essay called Kennecott Journey, The Paths Out of Town, in which he marveled at the freshness of the ruined company town and of the marks left on the land. Cronin concluded, if one wanted to make a case study for thinking about environmental change in the West as a whole, one could do a lot worse than make the long journey to Kennecott. William Cronin's work is a great example of how to examine the culturally constructed ways we look at a place. But by the time he visited the Wrangell Mountains, in my view, McCarthy's days as a forgotten ghost town were over. Wrangell St. Elias National Park and Preserve had been created by Congress in 1980, and negotiations with the National Park Service were well underway in 1992 for the purchase of the Kennecott ruins, a sale completed in 1998. This was already, in other words, McCarthy's modern era, when the remote mountain town had started growing into the outside magazine centerfold it resembles today. Cronin's essay juxtaposed a then of great industrial vigor and a now of romantic decay. My interest lay in the space between then and now. The time span of my new book begins with the last train leaving the Chittenden and Copper River valleys in 1938. It draws to a close in 1980 with the passage of Anilka, and then finally in 1983 with a mass shooting that took place on a day when the weekly mail plane was due to arrive. The story of those murders, really the story of those who died and the changes wrought for those who survived, fills the final third of my book. These unstable decades extended for half a century. The vast Chittenden River Valley was going back to nature, as the saying goes. But at the same time, a second migration of settlers was charging into the region with new frontier energy. National parks preserve stories, not only landscapes. But the Park Service, more comfortable with the then and now of Cronin's formula, struggled to tell the story of what they refer to as the in-between years. I started calling them the lost decades, at first because the stories were being lost, but also because the community did not know exactly where it was in the moment and what would be its path to the future. I was a little lost myself at times, looking for the story I wanted to tell. There were so many wonderful characters to write about, like Bill Barry, a holdover from mining days, known as Blazo Bill for his bold and occasionally misjudged method of starting fires in wood stoves without paper or kindling. Or George Flowers, a Black Mississippi sharecropper who came north from the mining rush, couldn't get a job at Kennecott because of his race, and lived a long life as a backwoods trapper. He was so happy to see the last train leave because the animals came back into the valley. During McCarthy's hippie days, there was a drug dealer known as Raven who stole 2 skulls from the community cemetery and used them as candle holders, evidently putting a curse on his own skull, which was subsequently crushed by a grizzly bear and then fatally penetrated by a rival drug dealer's bullet. All these stories. At one point in the mid-1950s, a very conventional tourist definition of ghost towns imposed itself in the valley when Cordova Airlines started flying tourists out to the nearby territorial airstrip at May Creek in the DC-3. Buildings at Kennecott still had calendars on the wall from 1938. And personal records were spilling out of the file drawers at the hospital and the jail. This came during a broad revival in the 1950s of public interest in Western ghost towns, with automobile tourism and guidebooks and new landmark preservation efforts. Historian Patricia Limerick has described these tours of that era as pilgrimages to nowhere. The question framed by these deserted places was as haunting then in the age of the atomic bomb as it is today in the hothouse age of the Anthropocene. Question being, is this where we've been or where we're going? To historians of the Old West, such towns were tragic monuments to human endeavor or reminders of the precariousness of civilization's project. While to modern historians, they are communities crushed by callous economic forces, once hopeful places where, in Patty Limerick's words, we can learn from the landscape of failure. To Alaskans, the ruins at Kennecott have always been especially loaded with portent, given the state's vulnerable resource economies and its ingrained historical fear of becoming a ghost state. Territorial politicians railed against Kennecott for pulling up stakes, and in the words of Ernest Greening, leaving nothing but a hole in the ground. Bob Bartlett gave a tough speech about Kennecott at Alaska's Constitutional Convention, and it's not hard to draw a straight line from the bitterness about the hole left in the Wrangles to the resource ownership policies that made the new state rich beyond anyone's dreams. But easy lessons are not plentiful in these empty landscapes. The silence of a ghost town torments us. The meanings we extract depend so much on what we carry with us when we visit, whether we arrive as a tourist, a history buff, a true crime reporter, or a metaphysician gazing into the blank void of mortality. It's a silence where you can hear yourself think. As a writer, this appealed to me greatly because I think that's what good writing is really all about. Listening on the page to yourself think. However, it occurred to me this morning that that's also the mark of a lot of very bad undergraduate writing. So I should put in a word for the quality of the thinking and not just watching yourself think on the page. As I undertook this book project, my first job was to document who came and went, getting the local characters down on paper and trying to figure out where they stood in relation to one another. But eventually I needed to put this material to work in service of a greater story. I was writing about a place, but why this place? Without a narrative line to hold on to keep me from getting lost, I would be in danger of stumbling into the shallow swamps of local history. Local histories, like self-published pioneer memoirs, are an uneven lot. Their charms and their sins are that they tend to be discursive, digressive, meandering like those Wrangell Mountain glacial rivers that are constantly changing course because they're so overloaded with material. Overstuffed local history books are sometimes condescended to as a kind of naive folk art. I confess that as a newspaper journalist, I loved coming across these Bibles of local stories, preferring that they be written in a style that was slightly tone deaf, so that I didn't feel bad pillaging the best bits for what I was working on. The story I might be writing was not necessarily the story a community told about itself. A travel writer can take over a town and rip off its treasures as ruthlessly as any robber baron. I told the museum in Mccarthy I would write a local history, but I struggled with this tension between permissive sprawl and the cold-blooded dictates of narrative nonfiction. The New York publisher of my previous book expressed some tentative interest in a McCarthy book built around the Mail Day murders of 1983. My Papa Pilgrim book had been classified as true crime, and this might be an appropriate sequel. A psychopathic killer who thought he was defending wilderness by eliminating the people who live in it offered a powerful villain. But the community of McCarthy has always resisted having their story bend to the gravitational force of that one awful event. I now have my own ties to the place, and I can feel that resistance in my bones. So, what story was there to tell about the ghost town, apart from one built around a psychotic separation of man and nature? Well, to begin with, I was not looking to explain the reasons for the town's demise, the questions usually explored by historians of ghost towns. My subject was the town that slowly grew back after 1938. I started by focusing on relationships in that peculiar community. As pressures mounted from the outside world, local settlers worked to achieve consensus about holding those outside influences at bay. They were trying to protect their isolation. They resisted road improvements, and they cooperated only ambivalently with national park planners. The old collapsing bridge made out of sticks turned out to be their friend. And even after a highway bridge across the Copper was built in 1971, the only way an adventurous tourist could get to McCarthy itself was on a hand-pulled tram car suspended from a cable above a river of roaring whitewater. Locals described this tram as, quote, the perfect self-administering interview system. But even as they tried to slow down progress, these same settlers were concerned about the decay and collapse of the ghost town ruins, which provided such a vividly allegorical and almost religious tableau of nature's ultimate triumph over the ravages of extractive capitalism. They hoped to shore up those ruins and preserve them, not as a rebuilt Disneyland version of the past, but in that romantic half-fallen state they'd found when they first arrived. Every visitor, they declared, deserved the opportunity to have that same sense of discovery. Here then was my story, a quest narrative with real American character. Arrested progress, arrested decay. It seemed an effort to arrest time itself, as if it might be possible to preserve this brief historical aperture, this pastoral phase when human lives existed in scale and balance to the wilderness around them. Such a vision of rural felicity offered an intriguing alternative to the usual Alaska dichotomies, the same old political battles between resource extraction and conservation. It was also, I came to realize, a performative version of the unattainable middle landscape that obsessed American writers of the 19th century as they struggled to reconcile what Leo Marx called our continent's two opposing kingdoms of force, technology and nature, machine and garden. This middle landscape was a mirage, surely. That was always the point. It couldn't be found. But in Alaska, in the 1970s, as Congress debated the fine points of Alaska Native land claims and the D2 conservation lands, it did seem possible that maybe something could be worked out. Maybe the wilderness community itself could be part of what was being preserved. That, anyway, was the story of McCarthy, Alaska. It's hard to know what would have emerged if not for the murders of half the overwintering population in 1983. These do inevitably frame the ending to the ghost town decades into my book. But the book's conclusion is also about how a community responds to tragedy, and as in the Pilgrim family book, about how that response can be helped by the stories we tell afterwards. All these converging stories of McCarthy must find a way to account for change and loss. The dynamic mountains themselves, far from being the timeless monuments around which national parks are drawn, are eroding and changing constantly. Everything there is strikingly impermanent. The mountains, the buildings, the lives of the people who live there. Which brings me to the story of Amy Ashington, one of the 6 victims on the morning of the murders. Amy was an apple-cheeked young woman who flew to McCarthy on the mail plane in 1982 on a spiritual quest. She had recently graduated from Harvard with a degree in comparative religion and a thesis on Zen philosophy titled Climbing the Cold Mountain Path. When she exited the plane, she immediately recognized the eroding and ever-changing landscape of her studies. What surprised her, she wrote, was finding a community of like-minded people. She ended up falling in love, marrying a local mountain man and attaining a brief happiness. Amy's journals and letters, and the Chinese poetry translated by Schneider that she brought with her, gave the community a new story and gave me the title for my book. Returning finally to the theme of your conference, communities remembered and imagined, I suspect it was meant mainly to refer to 2 different kinds of communities, real ones and made up ones. But for me, it also describes the 2 stages of writing history as I experienced them. The journalist and the historian must first remember a particular community as accurately as possible, and then imagination gives a form to those facts. The writer tells small stories and then eventually the big story of the relationships that define a place and a time. If the narrative is successful, if it finds its form, the impermanent place may survive. The washed out bridge gets its epic after all. I will end and then do questions And with the words of the great Italian novelist Italo Calvino, who was surely thinking along these lines when he described the lost city of Ersilia in his novel, Invisible Cities. The book is composed of stories told by Marco Polo to Kubla Khan. In Ersilia, the great traveler told his patron, to establish the relationships that sustain the city's life, the inhabitants stretch strings from the corners of the houses, white or black or gray or black and white, according to whether they mark a relationship of blood, of trade, authority, agency. When the strings become so numerous that you can no longer pass among them, the inhabitants leave. The houses are dismantled. Only the strings and their supports remain. From a mountainside, camping with their household goods, Ersilia's refugees look at the labyrinth of taut strings and poles that rise in the plain. That is the city of Ersilia still. They are nothing. They rebuild Ersilia elsewhere. They weave a similar pattern of strings, which they would like to be more complex and at the same time more regular than the other. Then they abandon it and take themselves and their houses still farther away. Thus, when traveling in the territory of Ersilia, you come upon the ruins of the abandoned cities, without the walls which do not last, without the bones of the dead which the wind rolls away. Spiderwebs of intricate relations seeking a form. So that's my thoughts on communities remembered and imagined, and we can have a conversation a little bit about those themes if you'd like.
Oh,
Karen?
thanks, Tom. That was great. I don't know if Rachel, you want to moderate the questions or you want me to do it? I don't know what happened to Rachel. Oh,
Here I am. Yes, if you'd like, I can moderate the questions. And does that mean that I call on people whose hands I see raised?
yes, and then I can get them to yes. And there is one, Nancy Bird says, thanks, Tom. That was wonderful. That was in the chat. But yeah, if you see people want to talk and raise their hand, and then I can.
I was rereading, Patty Limerick wrote a great piece in the 90s about ghost towns, and she talked, I'd forgotten, she talked about Leo Marx in there and said for the Western ghost town, rather than the machine in the garden, the better metaphor might be the abandoned machine in the desert. That was her take on that. And one other footnote, going back and reading those Leo Marx, that original book, I was wondering, well, I wonder whatever, when did he die? Because I probably would have missed that in Homer. And so I looked him up on the internet and found out that next month he will be celebrating his 102nd birthday. So that was kind of a nice thing to learn while working on this talk.
Tom, could you tell us a little bit more about the machine in the garden metaphor, or what that meant?
Well, it was the encounter between the American pastoral dream that seemed to motivate the Daniel Boones of the world, but also the whole ideal of what was going to be achieved as the American civilization moved west across the Indian lands. But at the same time, the technology that was driving this would often disrupt, because it was a big industrial project that required a lot of capital, disrupt that dream of what they were hoping to find as they moved west. And so there was this inherent contradiction, and he was looking at it, especially the way that Ahab and and his whaling ships, and Thoreau with the railroad coming past Walden Pond, and just breaks down these different stories and describes that tension, and it seemed to shed light on the American project as well as on their individual works, and in some ways it's not really been certainly a 21st century American obsession, except maybe in Alaska.
All right, thank you. And I see there's a Chris Allen has a question, and his question is, Tom, have attitudes in McCarthy regarding the National Park Service changed over the decades?
Yeah, one of the things, one of the themes in the new book is, how attitudes evolved through the 1970s toward the park, or the proposed park. And really, I was sort of surprised to realize that there was a much more intensity of feeling out there in McCarthy about proposals from the state to build a 2-lane road, a full road out into McCarthy from Chittenden, than there were about the park. The park was, of course, hugely controversial, and Chris has written about this so well, statewide in Alaska, and there were people who had those feelings in McCarthy as well, opposed to creating a big, having a blanket of regulation descend over what had been kind of open country, and others who saw it as, that this is going to happen. Maybe we can do this in a way that would protect our community and its future. So there was a lot of give and take within the community. I think as some of the park advocates rather smugly predicted in the 70s, attitudes have changed because it's kind of a park now and there's no getting around it. I think that the whole Pilgrim family adventure was kind of a defining moment for the park in terms of, is this still a wilderness community, or is the park really here, and we need to abide by certain understandings about what that means. And I think now, there are very few people who were even around at the time when the debate was going on about the park. And so people who've come there have moved into a park, and so they have a different and more accepting attitude, I think, toward what it is. And, still hoping to find a way for Alaska parks to be somewhat different from the sort of model in the lower 48, where communities at the edge of parks are full of log cabin motels and lines of tour buses. I think they'd like it to be a little bit different.
All right. There's a question from Stephen Haycox, and that is Kennecott McCarthy an example of Patty Limerick's legacy of conquest, or is the present Kennecott reconstruction an NPS establishment and the McCarthy folks who now survive through their service to the NPS tourists?
Well, I think the park is rebuilding it as an illustration of the legacy of conquest. Patty Limerick came up to Alaska in 1993 to speak to the Alaska Humanities Forum, and I sought her out for an interview for the Anchorage Daily News, and went back to look at that story recently. And she did, in fact, talk about the illusions of abundance that Western ghost towns reinforced. And she thought Kennecott, she mentioned Kennecott specifically as a perfect example of what she had written about in her sort of landmark book about reimagining Western history, like legacy of conquest. And she said she regretted that she had sort of dismissed Alaska in that book in one one regrettable parentheses. So I think that that was for her an example. But it's an example of the legacy of conquest to historians. You have to understand the story in order to appreciate what it's a legacy of. And if you arrive as a tourist and look at it, you might not understand that, except that the Park Service now in the last couple of years has put together, I think, a pretty effective storytelling series of displays there that help explain why this industrial landscape is such a good example of those forces and those processes that she wrote about in that book. So I think that the reconstruction, which is kind of inevitable, they were trying, and I mentioned in the speech, how they were trying to do figure out a way to arrest the decay of those buildings, but which is kind of what they did with Bodie, California, the ghost town down there, where they tried to keep it in that sort of half-fallen state. But that's incredibly expensive. I mean, they really had to go back in and rebuild some of the basics of the building so that they could be maintained. It was kind of funny because the people who owned Kennecott and were selling it to the Park Service, two of them were dentists, and I think they understood that you can't keep things half decayed. It doesn't work. So that's why the rebuilding is a little fresher than people maybe wanted to see, but it will probably be sustainable.
Great. And also referring to Limerick, Ian Hartman has a question. He says, "Great talk, Tom. I appreciate how you put McCarthy into the broader context of the American West. Could you say a little bit more about how McCarthy is different or similar to other Western boom towns that went bust and then had something of a renaissance?"
Well, its isolation, I think, is still working in its favor, in that you can still go out there and feel the past around you a little more than you can in some of the Western towns that have become more touristy. I'm not that familiar with the lower 48 tour books of the ghost towns today, but the Alaska, one of the things that distinguishes Kennecott is the scale, the immensity of the mountain wilderness and the ambition necessary to get the copper out, and the incredible value of the copper that they found in there. They mine copper in the open pits of Utah, and they find a 1% ore deposit, and it's a big deal. And here they were digging out copper that was, it started out at like 70% pure copper. They'd never found anything like that in the world. And so it was limited in its size, and they ran out eventually of that valuable deposit, but it was so incredible. And so the building a 200-mile railroad into the biggest mountains in North America, it's just the immensity of all of that, and the capital that it took, and the brawn, and just the energies of all of that was so much more, I think, than most of the boom and bust towns in the lower 48. And so then the abandonment was that much more dramatic as well. And the landscape left behind, full of all the old machinery and buildings and bathroom fixtures and everything that for the community that grew up, this sort of scavenging community was probably well beyond what you would have seen in the American West, because it was such a big resource to draw on. I mean, people would just sort of take truckloads of stuff out of Kennecott and for their own, cabin work or homestead work, and they called it Kennecrap. They had great a great period of helping themselves, but then there was a lot of resentment once the tourists started coming in the 50s. When the tourists started helping themselves, the people out there felt like, wait a minute, this is our stuff. We don't want you driving off with it. And so that was an interesting tension that I talk about in the book as well.
Well, great. You've got a few more questions here. One of them from David Ramser is, why did you opt for a small local publisher for this book rather than one of the big boys to whom you presumably have access?
Well, I don't know if the big boys wanted a story about, the local history. I think it goes to that tension between writing a local history and writing a nonfiction narrative. And, I had started out with the idea of doing this as a history of the area for those 50 years. And I kind of didn't want to change that course and write a true crime story about the murders, which is probably what the one narrative strand that New York publishers might have been interested in. I could have spent a year writing a proposal and sort of banging on doors in New York, but I was happy to do this, and it worked out. Porphyry Press was ready to get off the ground in McCarthy, and Jeremy, was connected to the museum and lived in the community, and he was eager to do this. And so that seemed like, just let's do this as a hometown project. I didn't need to try and make a ton of money on this. In fact, we wanted to raise some money for the museum with it originally, and the fellowship from the Rasmussen helped, but I wasn't at the stage in my career where I was trying to build one book into the next big book. I just wanted to do what I wanted to do, and so working with Porphyry Press was kind of a great way to do it just the way I wanted. I don't know, I suppose if they think that I've written a brilliant book as a result, they can come talk to Jeremy. Does that answer your question, David? I don't know if that is honest.
Well, Nancy Lord has a question about your research process. And she asks, Tom, could you talk a little about your research process? How did you locate sources, and what lessons might there be for other historians and writers? And,
Boy, it took 3 or 4 years to do this, and a lot of that involved finding those sources and getting them to trust me and talk to me, just like my other books. Certainly writing about the travels that I did in the 80s out in rural Alaska, getting people in the native villages to just relax and tell me what it was like, what their lives were like, required a lot of relearning of my own approach to interviewing, a kind of a quieter and more relaxed approach. And then certainly, had to find a way to get the Hale family kids to talk to me as well. So there was always, there were lots of journalism lessons that were helpful. And there was a resistance for a long time in talking about this period in McCarthy, especially because of the murders, I think. But I have a cabin out there and have a my own history out there. And so that helped a lot, I think, over time. You know, the weird thing is that the first time I went to McCarthy, I was the police reporter for the Anchorage Daily News. I flew out there, and right after the murders the next day to do a story about it. And I looked around and thought, wow, this is really Alaska now. But what just happened here? And it was such a complicated jumble of emotional, reactions and curiosity that it took me, decades to kind of work through and figure that out. And kind of coincidentally ended up, having a cabin out there and building and being part of that community for a long time. And so that certainly not only helped me win the trust of people to sort of start sharing their stories, but also to figure out where the documents are. Now, the Park Service has done a pretty good job of pulling together a lot of the documents that exist. There are some that I really couldn't find that I would like to get at. And maybe there'll be another edition of this someday. For instance, the Atomic Energy Commission, like this was a shocker. So the Atomic Energy Commission, when they were doing the nuclear project, or proposing to blow up atomic bombs at Point Hope and build a harbor up there to demonstrate how great atomic bombs could be for peaceful uses. We're out looking for other projects, and they sent a delegation to Kennecott and went down into the old mines. They were looking for a place to blow up an atomic bomb, and they had some idea that they could shoot it off inside the mountain and then flood the mountain, and it would then the water as it comes out it would leach all the remaining copper out of the geological features there, and then they could somehow take that water and get the copper out of it, extract the copper. It was a really weird idea, but they were, seriously looking at this, and they put out two reports, and I've only seen thanks to Logan Hovis from the Park Service, I've only seen the non-classified report where they talk about reopening Kennecott and give their 12 pages of analysis of the features and everything, and they never say on there why they're doing this, but apparently there's a classified report somewhere about what their conclusions were, and that would be certainly interesting to find. But there was it was fairly easy once I had the non-classified one to search the names on that original report from the Atomic Energy Commission to use Google and to find an oral history that one of them had left about. And then we went to Kennecott, and I had on my shorts, and I went down in this freezing cold, ice strewn mine adit, trying to figure out if we could set off a bomb down there. And so, that was, in the end, I was able to piece the story together without the classified report. But there are, it was just a lot of random bits and pieces that had to be pulled together to figure out, first of all, to figure out what was going on out there during those years, and then to figure out what story to tell. But this was the first story that had been written about the area. In a lot of places, you come in as a historian, and there have been several books, and there have been local histories already done, and if you want to find the narrative, you can sort of sit back and figure out what you're looking for when you start. But in this case, I had to really kind of do all that primary research, and then I think the last year of the book production was really trying to bring the story of the place into the foreground of my earlier drafts, which were a little bit more, as I said, the kind of discursive local history.
Well, there's a related question from Rich Matson that it says, how were you able to break down barriers with the various individuals to share their own intimate stories? And you've told us a little about that, but if you want to develop that a little more.
I think just being out there and being around counted for a lot. And I guess that the Pilgrim family book was seen as a reasonably sensitive, product that wasn't, exploitive of the community or of the kids. And so maybe that added to credibility. I hope that a long career in Alaska will count for something, as a journalist with a byline showing up on a regular basis. You can develop a bad reputation or a good one, and maybe that helped. But at the same time, there were people who I couldn't get through to talk to, who kind of passed me on to somebody else, or didn't return calls. And I'm sure they had lots of stories that are still, not in this book. So I can't claim that I broke down every barrier that I set out to break. There is something a little bit exploitive about the writer coming in and trying to take material and do something with it. And I think you get judged by what it is you're trying to do with it. What end are you trying to serve? And I think maybe my sensitivity about that was one of the reasons that I was reluctant to jump into a true crime book about this period.
Great. Well, the questions are still coming in fast and furious.
Uh-oh.
So we have one from Jim Magdance, and he asks, he says, many small communities in Alaska face a balance of trade problem. They import fuel, food, equipment, and supplies, but they export very little to produce revenue to pay for the food and fuel and supplies. Is this a problem in modern McCarthy? And if it's not a problem, what was their solution?
Well, and that's one of the reasons, to answer the earlier question as well, that attitudes have changed toward the Park Services, because the park is a big employer out there now, and they have a local hire provision, and so people who have got land out there and are building cabins are also, kind of first in line for these fairly high-paying construction jobs and the rehabilitation of Kennecott. I'm not sure, 15, 20 years ahead, if the work will be done, and those jobs may not be so plentiful out there, and the community will be bigger, and then maybe there will be different social and economic pressures on McCarthy in the future. But right now, there's a fair amount of work in the town for people who are there. There's also there's a lot of tourists who obviously find their way out there. Nothing like the rest, nothing like Denali, but enough that there's a couple of businesses that have started, guide businesses and restaurants, and it's still small scale and in an appealing way, I think. And it'll be sad if it becomes a big, cruise line operation with big buses and outside ownership of lodging, but it's still very locally based right now. So I think between the tourists and the Park Service employment, there's not that kind of empty economy that is such a problem for so many small Alaska villages elsewhere. It's not a sustainable model, perhaps, and I don't know if there's what the future holds out there, though.
Great. We have a question from Ron Inouye, and he asks, he says, please comment about local leadership in isolated communities like McCarthy. What social, economic, or political factors affect public opinion?
Well, I think there's a certain self-selection process about people out there, that they're going, I feel more, and this may be naive, but I feel like people out there are going there because they like it the way it is, and less of what was sort of classically true in McCarthy and elsewhere, where you had business entrepreneurs going out to get in on the ground floor and really wanting to turn it into a boom place where they could make some money and then leave. I feel like finally get to the end of the road, there's no place else to go, and you say, okay, I like it here, I want it to stay nice. I mean, they're against growth, but they're not necessarily trying to cash in the big way and move out the way some of the people that I write about in the 60s and 50s were maybe looking upon McCarthy that way. So in that sense, there's a bit more consensus. But on the other hand, McCarthy is kind of famous for having its feuds and its conflicts out in the open. And that was true all the way back to the time when there were maybe 6 people who stayed over after the last train left. And 10 years later, there were just a handful of people there, or people old timers who would come back for the summer. And there were like 2 guys who had such a feud that they would always check with the mail plane to make sure that they weren't both coming back in on the same flight. They had to be on separate flights, and they each had their trails that they would walk out of town for their exercise, and they went in opposite directions. So that's your side of the valley to go hiking, and this is my side. So they didn't ever have to deal with one another. I think it had something to do with a woman back in the day. And so, for one reason or another, these kinds of feuds have been prominent. And the more recent one was over whether to build a bridge or a footbridge and how to control access. And that access is still a big issue. I mean, I think there's a problem out there now, in particular with 4-wheeler traffic coming in, tourists who can take their 4-wheelers across the footbridge, and there's not that many roads, and that can be a kind of overwhelming to the community to have social media bandying about this sort of appeals to say, come on out, so there's still plenty of issues to argue over out there. It's a kind of a communal, they have a non-municipal committee that serves as a local government, and so they have a good forum for hashing these things out these days.
Great. There's a question from Katie Ringsmith. She says, hi, Tom. When I was in graduate school, new Western scholars like Richard White, Cronin, and Patty Limerick were finally making inroads into challenging the old Western history and changing the way we talk about the West, and specifically the frontier in academia. Although incidentally, they didn't really deal with Alaska very well because it's so big. But now, 20 years later, is there a new generation of scholars challenging the constructs of the new Western historians? And what advice would you give Alaska historians and how we talk about McCarthy, Kennecott, wilderness communities, and the entrenched image of the frontier that people still hold? How should we discuss these intersects in the classroom?
Boy, that's why I want to listen in for the rest of That's why I joined the Alaska Historical Society, was to learn the answers to those questions. That's not my, I learned a lot reading Katie's work about this area and others. And I can see, that the DNA of that generation of historians she cites. I can see her working through that for Alaska, and I really appreciate that. But is there a new generation that's, if anything, I would guess that the new generation is pushing to have even a more sort of harsh light shown on the old narrative of, building the future America that, Rex Beach wrote about in the Iron Trail. But I'm not, I don't know. There's a whole language of academic writing now that I can sometimes barely understand. When I went down to did a night fellowship there at Stanford, I took one of these postmodern history classes, and I was kind of baffled by the conversation in the seminar room. And as I gradually figured out what they were talking about, I kind of objected. And I was kind of I was a young fogey at that point, but I was saying, what do you mean there's no truth? My journalism career has always been about trying to find out what's true and what isn't. And this is that conversation about everyone having their own reality that was coming pretty much from the left on the campus, and yet it became and after 2016, it became the national conversation from the right, and a kind of disavowing of what newspapers were able to do, like, oh, it's just fake news. And so I think that's all really fascinating. I think that's probably the new conversation that must be going on regarding the historiography and the understanding of Western history. But how that all fits together, I'm going to just stay tuned and learn. And I hope to sit down with Katie, and she can help explain some of that to me.
Great. Well, here's a specific question from Carol Gales. Did you allow interviewees to review how you use their material before publication?
That's a good question, because I would never do that as a newspaper reporter.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, there were in several cases, not routinely and not in all cases, but in sort of important cases where people were sort of the focus of the chapter or their family history, or I wanted to get it right. And I was, if they had some objection to how something was portrayed, I wanted to talk about that and understand why they were objecting. I never did that on the Pilgrim family book. I didn't want to have any sort of family review, but in this case, it seemed appropriate. So, yeah, there were 6 or 8, and got some very helpful, elaborations really out of that. I don't feel like I had to take anything out that was crucial to the telling. There were a sentence here or a sentence there that were maybe a little bit wise ass, that jokes that I finally learned. They're really fun for about a year in the manuscript, but last time through, you kind of take that stuff out and you end up sleeping a lot better afterwards.
Thank you. There's a comment from Nancy Bird. This is just to everyone, just mentioning that there's the Rasmussen Foundation grantee recently created some beautiful paintings and interpretive panels about the Kennecott and Iceberg Lake region. And she gives us a link to check it out in the chat. And at this point, maybe I'll ask Karen. Karen, are you aware of any other questions that have come up, or?
No, you got the ones in the Q&A.
I did.
Thank you. And thank you for Carol for pointing that out. And for experienced webinar people, they are used to using that Q&A panel, but then the attendees can't see the questions. So we're trying to keep it all in one place in the chat so everybody can see the questions. And it makes it easier for us moderators to only look in one place. So there, I don't see any other questions. Somebody wants to raise their hand, I don't know. I'm dealing with login problems. For some reason, some people can't get into the session, so thank goodness we're recording it.
I see. Well, if there are no other questions, maybe we can let Tom off the hook for now and thank him for a wonderful presentation.
And I'd say thank you for a wonderful book. I've had the benefit of getting to read an advance copy since I was doing the intro. I had to know what I was talking about. So it's a really good read, and some great, individual stories and profiles of people. And Tom, I like the part about Amy, that section, and learning about her. It was a really special part of the story that I didn't know about.
I can finish by reading one of Hanshan's poems, the ones translated by Gary Schneider. It's very short. These were from like the 7th century in China. And he was a hermit poet who wrote some of his poems painted them on rocks. And men ask the way to Cold Mountain. Cold Mountain, there's no through trail. In summer, ice doesn't melt. The rising sun blurs in swirling fog. How did I make it? My heart's not the same as yours. If your heart was like mine, you'd get it and be right here. I think that's a great epigraph for McCarthy.
That's really nice. That's a great way to end it. Thank you, Tom.
And so Rachel, we're gonna, the next session's at 1:30 this afternoon.
That's correct. And we'll use the same Zoom link to get into that.
We hope. That's the plan. I'm having all kinds of problems, but with people but anyway, thank you all of you guys who were able to log in with 90% of no problems. And hopefully it will work again this afternoon and the next few days.
I'm really looking forward to the next few days. So thanks for including me here.
Well, thanks, Tom. We're glad you're going to stick around and listen to some of the other talks. It's great.
All right. And I hope you'll all be back for this afternoon's panel on the ghosts of mining communities, which is certainly a good segue from this part of it.
Okay.